Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, what are we looking at? Difference in repetition. Man, 17 videos already. How many more have we got to go? Hopefully we'll finish by around 25, 26-ish. That's kind of probably where we're going to be ending up. Anyway, in this video we're going to finish chapter 4. And we're going to spend this video talking about the difference between differentiation with a T and differentiation with a C. And we'll also talk about, and so that latter, differentiation with a C, is basically the actualization, the incarnation of the idea into, as it becomes, as it manifests, as it appears. And so we'll talk about spatio-temporality as well, kind of briefly actually, but that will come up as well. So the first section of the video today, differentiation with a T and differentiation with a C. So Deleuze starts by saying that we can think of the object as being made up of two parts. And these two parts, differentiation with a T and differentiation with a C. So differentiation first with a T. This is just the virtual. So differentiation with a T determines the virtual content of the idea as problem. We've talked about that a lot. There's no need to elaborate on that. What we haven't mentioned so much is the way that this is, or the way that the virtual, that is the process of differentiation, the virtual is opposed to the actual, not the real. So the movement from the virtual is from the virtual not to the real, but from the virtual to the actual. So it's a movement of actualization. We may have talked about this. I seem to remember having mentioned this before. Anyway, as opposed to a movement which would go from something which is not real to then being real. And we're going to discuss that in a moment. But the main point is that differentiation captures that movement from the virtual to the actual. So differentiation is perfectly real. That's the main point. It's real, just real as virtual. But it's not unreal. So the real for Deleuze includes the virtual in the idea. The virtual must be defined as strictly a part of the real object. The reality of the virtual consists of the differential elements and relations, along with the singular points which correspond to them. So that's just the idea, that structure of the idea that we've talked about already. Singular points, just note those again, singular points, points of articulation within the idea. Those are what get condensed. We talked about when we talked about vice diction, condensing those singularities. And that's a process of incarnation, which we will look at a little bit later on in the video. So that's that first part anyway, opposed to the actual, not the real. And he goes on to say that the virtual, the elements and relations which form that structure of the idea, is determined by the double process of reciprocal determination and complete determination. Okay, nice, that's just revision. But we'll fit that into a diagram a little bit later. There are two other key words to take away from this section about differentiation. The first is the object is complete. So it's complete although it's not whole, Deleuze says. The fact that it's virtual doesn't stop it from being complete. We've talked about it being completely determined, right? So that's what this word is intending to capture, the way that the object is complete in this differentiation, even though it's not whole yet. And the other key word is ideal. So this differentiation is what Deleuze calls the ideal part of the object. And we'll contrast that with differentiation with a C in just a moment. What is complete is only the ideal part of the object, which participates with other parts of objects in the idea, other relations, other singular points, but never constitutes an integral whole as such. Okay, nice. So just the kind of idea of what differentiation with a T is. And just before we leave this little section, Deleuze talks about three ways that the virtual is different from the possible. Because that's something that he says is it's kind of a danger along the way to trying to understand what he's talking about with this idea of virtuality. So the first difference is that the possible is opposed to the real. So the possible is originally not real, and then when it's the movement that it's susceptible to is one which sees it becoming real. So it moves from the not real to the real, from unreality to reality. And remember, this is in opposition, in contradistinction to the virtual, which we saw was a movement from the virtual or the non-actual to the actual. So that's a movement of actualization. The movement that possibility follows is one of realization. So that's the first difference. The second difference is that the possible refers to identity in the concept. So the concept, when we take an idea, if you like, when we take a concept, the features of that concept, when they become real, as in, and maybe an example helps here. So if I have the concept of a triangle, for example, one of the features of a triangle is that it has three sides. Okay, so nice and simple. When I move from the concept to the which is currently not real, when I make that a reality by drawing a picture of a triangle, for example, that also has three sides, and the three sides that I end up drawing that become real refer directly back to the three sides in the concept, and those three sides in the concept were already established. They were already fixed. It was what it was, that function, or that feature. That feature of a triangle as having three sides is clear in the concept, as opposed to the virtual in the idea, where it's not clear, right? It's undetermined originally. It's only when those elements engage in that reciprocal determination, it's that they then become the elements that they are. They become elements at all. And then they go from reciprocal determination, complete determination, and that's when you get the actual elements themselves. But prior to that, they weren't actualized. They weren't they weren't there at all. Or they were there, but only as virtual. So they had to there was a process that had to take place in order for them to emerge. It's not like that when it comes to concepts and the features that make up those concepts. So the possible refers to the concept, and the features that are in that concept are identical. They are already there. They're fixed. They're certain. They're clear. They're distinct. They're all of those things that the virtual is not. So that's the second difference. The third difference is that the possible, as something open to realization, is the image of the real, which is to say that the real resembles the possible. And so we've got those two key ideas here for Deleuze, identity and resemblance, and they're both in possibility. They're both in the concept, and that's how the virtual, the idea, differs from them. So if the real resembles the possible, it means that existence adds nothing to the concept. It merely doubles like with like. So if you think about, go back to that example of the triangle, where in the concept of a triangle, we've got an object with three sides. That when it becomes real, so when I draw it on a piece of paper, that the three sides that I draw exactly map onto the three sides that were in that feature of the three sides, which is in the concept, that concept of having an object that has three sides. It's a direct mapping. It's doubling like with like. So he asks, what difference is there then between an existent and a non-existent in that case? And the only difference is that existence is the same as, just outside the concept. That's the only difference, which doesn't amount to a real difference for Deleuze, because basically it reduces to a difference between the physical and the non-physical, right? This spatially extended versus the unextended. And that isn't a real distinction. It's not a real difference here. It doesn't qualify as a real difference. And we can go even further than this, because in truth what this means is that the possible is produced after the fact. And this is kind of a when I first encountered this idea, this was quite revolutionary for me. But I encountered it in Bergson, which is where Deleuze gets it from. And he says that the possible is retroactively fabricated in the image of what resembles it. So the possible doesn't pre-exist the reality. The reality comes first, and then we retroactively fabricate the possibility to match it, which is a great idea. Bergson explains it in more detail, I think, than Deleuze does here. But yeah, beautiful difference between the possible and the virtual. The actualization of the virtual, on the contrary, always takes place by difference, divergence, or differentiation. Actualization breaks with resemblance as a process no less than it does with identity as a principle. Actual terms never resemble the singularities they incarnate. And that last sentence is quite crucial. Actual terms never resemble the singularities they incarnate. And think about something like genes. Genes, when they incarnate as actual traits in an organism, they have absolutely no resemblance. You know, that the trait of having blue eyes has absolutely no resemblance to the genes which determine that, as opposed to that the concept of the triangle, which has three sides, and it's clearly and directly presented in the drawing of the triangle, when the triangle is made real. So a nice distinction there, nice and an important difference for Deleuze and this whole notion of the virtual and differentiation. And then we can close this section where Deleuze says that conflating the virtual and the possible is to conflate the order of the idea and the order of the concept. Again, that crucial division that marks all of Deleuze, the idea and the concept. And that brings us to differentiation with a C. And so this is the actual as opposed to the virtual in differentiation with a T. So differentiation expresses the actualization of this virtual and the constitution of solutions. And these solutions are brought about, Deleuze says, by local integrations. So some more terminology. Just contrast solutions with problem. That's the key contrast there. With differentiation with a T, the virtual, we talked about differentiation determining the virtual content of the idea as a problem. And here, differentiation with a C, the actualization of the virtual and the constitution of solutions. So solutions and problems is a good way to pass these two notions. He says that there are four terms which are all synonyms for this: actualize, differentiate with a C, integrate, and solve. So that's what differentiation is all about. It's about actualization. It's taking that idea which has been reciprocally and completely determined in relations and in singularities, and then actualizing it. And I've got a nice quote to express this as well. An organism is nothing if not the solution to a problem, as are each of its differentiated organs, such as the eye, which solves a light problem. But nothing within the organism, no organ, would be differentiated without the internal milieu endowed with a general effectivity or integrating power of regulation. So, okay, there's just really a couple of things to note there. I think it's a good quote because, first of all, we're back dealing with concrete realities. The organism is the solution to the problem. It's a biological problem. It's in that biological order, that biological domain. And just thinking of the organism as a solution to a problem, I think it's a really elegant and enlightening way to think about it. I think it gets at it opens the door to understanding this kind of a deep metaphysical truth, I think. If you can understand organisms not just as physical things evolving according to, the laws and according to physical, biological, chemical processes, but if you can understand it at this deeper level as a solution to a problem, as the second half of this picture that Deleuze is presenting, the second half of differentiation with a C. I think it's a nice way to frame this so that you can grasp the deeper truths going on. The other thing was, in that quote, this idea of the internal milieu. No organ, he said, will be differentiated without the internal milieu endowed with a general effectivity or integrating power of regulation. So that milieu is just the virtual multiplicity. It's the idea. It's that differentiating with a T. That's what we've spent most of this video talking about so far. And that's differentiation. That's the difference between the virtual and the actual. So I have a diagram to try and capture this and explain it a little bit more. basically we're talking about the structure of difference here, and it's structured, it's broken up into two halves. The first half is differentiation with a T, and this includes the varieties of relations. So this is the reciprocal determination, and also the singular points, and this corresponds to complete determination. This first half, Deleuze also calls the dialectical half of the object. And then we move to look at the second half, which is differentiation with a C. And this is, in the first case, the qualities or diverse species which actualize the varieties, and also the number or the distinct parts actualizing the singular points. And this is characterized by extensity and organization. And you can see how, so each half of the object, differentiation with a T, differentiation with a C, is divided into two again. And this is where the difference between actualization and incarnation comes about, because the first, the varieties of relations, are actualized in the qualities or diverse species, and the singular points are incarnated in the number or the distinct parts. So it's a minor point, but it's just one of some of the terms that you should be familiar with if you're going to have a full understanding of Deleuze, I think. So one thing that's worth emphasizing here is on the right-hand side of that diagram, the differentiation with a C, that half of the object. The distinction there between qualities or diverse species and the number or the distinct parts. So those are the two ways that ideas are actualized, being actualized and incarnated, to use the terminology. And so it might help to think of this in terms of a concrete example. So let's take genes again. Genes are a system of differential relations. So that's the differentiation with the T half of the diagram. And those differential relations are incarnated both in a series, both in a species, they're actualized in a species, and they're incarnated in the specific organic parts which make up the members of that species. So you've got the genes or the species, which comes about through the varieties of relations within the genes being actualized into a system of relations defined by certain qualities. So when those genes actualize, when the system of relations actualize as concrete realities, they're actualized into a species, into this broader grouping connected through qualities. And at the same time, those genes as singular points are incarnated into distinct parts. That is to say, individual organisms made up of individual organs. And that's represents kind of a more localized, if you like, form of actualization. So you've got these two kind of, and that's important, I think, this distinction between the way that ideas actualize into species and incarnate into distinct parts. I think that's maybe not so much in this book, but I think later on it becomes more important for Deleuze. I seem to remember reading that in Anti-Oedipus, although I try not to remember too much from that book if I can help it. But that seems to be like an important idea, I think, in the bigger picture of Deleuze's work. Okay, so we also look at distinctness and clarity here. And so distinctness and clarity, there's definitely a reference to Descartes, right? Who held distinctness and clarity to be the final goal, the ultimate aim, right? To achieve distinctness and clarity. And this is what Deleuze calls common sense, good sense. This is all aligned with that. And we've kind of talked about that before. Distinctness and clarity for Descartes then are related such that the more distinct a thing is, the clearer it is. And vice versa. The clearer something is, the more distinct it is. For Deleuze, however, it's the opposite case. The clearer a thing is, the less distinct it is. And the more distinct a thing is, the less clear it becomes. And this makes sense now when we understand this picture of differentiation with a T, differentiation with a C, those two halves of the object. Because distinctness refers to differentiation with a T, so reciprocal and complete determination within the idea, while clarity refers to differentiation with a C, i.e. the actualization or the incarnation. So you can see now how those it makes sense for Deleuze to say the more distinct a thing is, the less clear it is, because the more distinct something is, the less it's been actualized. If it's perfectly distinct and hasn't been actualized at all, so that it's not clear in any sense of the word, because clarity refers to actualization, differentiation with a C. If all you have is the idea, then there's no clarity to be had. It's perfectly distinct, but there's no clarity. And then at the other extreme, if all you have, if all you grasp is the concrete reality, the actualized idea, then you have perfect clarity, but you have absolutely nothing is distinct in that, in the actualized entity, whatever it might be, the concrete reality, because you don't understand the idea behind it, the idea from which it emerged. So once you have those two halves in your pocket, this claim of Deleuze's makes sense, that the more distinct something is, the less clear, and vice versa. So instead of the more, or the phenomenological, I guess, distinction between wholes and parts, where clarity comes from maybe the whole, right? So the clearer something is, something appears clear when it's grasped as a whole, as opposed to being distinct when it's grasped in terms of parts, or vice versa, whatever I'm not sure, you could go either way with that, whether it's whole is distinct or whether the parts are distinct. But instead of that framework for this notion of distinctness and clarity, Deleuze is replacing it with a virtual actual framework. So the virtual is distinct, the actual is clear, and there's a continuum, sliding continuum between the two. And this brings us to our second section today, which is spatio-temporal dynamism. So the question Deleuze starts with here is, how does actualization actually occur? In other words, why does differentiation with a T, why does it differentiate with a C along the two complementary paths of qualities and number, species and parts? And the answer is that beneath the actual qualities and extensities, beneath the species and the parts, there are spatio-temporal dynamisms. And these are the actualizing or differentiating with a C agencies. So this is kind of a nice picture as well, that the engine, if you like, behind actualization is the spatio-temporal dynamism. And he talks about embryology, which has shown that the division of an egg into parts is secondary in relation to the more significant morphogenetic movements. So in other words, it's the whole, what he says, the whole kinematics of the egg, which is the driving force behind the way the egg develops, or the way that the embryo develops in the egg, as opposed to the division of the egg into parts. That's something that comes along afterwards, but there's this more important, this more significant dynamism beneath the parts themselves. And the dynamism is important. This notion of some kind of driving force is important because all actualization presupposes specific spatio-temporal dynamisms, which make the actualization what it is, which are not just something which can be evenly applied to any and all actualizations, any and all ideas being actualized, because the actualization takes a role in producing the final solution. For example, Deleuze gives the example of 24 cellular elements, and the ways you can get to that are different, right? You could have a structure or a dynamism of 2 by 12, or one that goes 2 by 4 plus 2 by 8. So the way that the actualization comes about is important. It's a central part of the actualization. It's not just this fixed, static, identical force which is always the same. Rather, it's an integral part in the final solution. So he talks about spatio-temporal dynamisms being related to the process of actualization as dramas. And he says they dramatize the idea, which is an interesting notion, an interesting word, an interesting metaphor. Didn't really like it at first, but as I thought about it and reflected on it, it grew on me. Dramas. So he says they dramatize the idea. Why use this word though? And the reason is that he wants to emphasize the difference between space and time, understood as concepts through the lens of representation, and space and time as concrete consequences of this dynamism in the idea. And so once you have that, once you accept that, then this notion of drama makes more sense, and it's a nice counterpoint to that conceptual, representational way of thinking of space and time. Space and time for Deleuze aren't abstract background assumptions that are kind of static and unvarying. It's not just that they change according to laws, it's that they're fundamentally involved in the actualization of ideas, in the emergence of concrete realities. So I quite like that. Or I came to quite like it anyway, this idea of space and time as dramas. So space, just very briefly, he doesn't spend much time talking about space and time here, but he says space in actualization appears in multiple levels. Two, in fact, or two main ones. There's an internal space and an external extensity. So he says a living being is not only defined genetically by the dynamisms which determine its internal milieu, but also ecologically by the external movements which preside over its distribution within an extensity. So that's pretty fine, right? I mean, that's pretty fine. That's okay, right? There's an internal space, there's an external space as well. And it makes sense to call both of those things spaces. So the space within a living being, defined genetically, and a space outside that being, so defined ecologically. And those internal and external spaces are also divided into multiple spaces. So, and then they'd be divided into what we could call local for the internal and global for the external. Local and global integrations and connections, Deleuze says. So just space being manifested, being brought about, or maybe it's better to say bringing themselves about through the process of actualization. So they're the driver, remember, they're the dynamic force behind the actualization. And also time, how does time feature in actualization? Deleuze says the time of differentiation with a C appears as differential rhythms, as rates of growth, paces of development, decelerations or accelerations, durations of gestation, those kinds of things. So again, connecting them with very dynamic, evolving processes. It's a very active, right? Active sense of time, in contrast to the concept of time, the time viewed from the position of representation. So it is kind of a little bit odd, I think, to me that Deleuze doesn't make more of an effort to connect this part. We're talking about time. Doesn't make more of an effort to connect that back with the whole first half of the book, right? Those three syntheses of time. It doesn't get mentioned at all. But presumably, those three syntheses slot into here, perhaps as the emergence of time through the organism as a biological idea, right? Perhaps that's the connection. But yeah, it's funny that he doesn't make that more explicit. And we spent so much time, no pun intended, talking about time, and then we come to it here where it has this, we see how it plays this more fundamental role in the actualization of ideas, and it's just, we just get this little snippet about differential rhythms. But like I say, presumably those three syntheses fit into here as an example of this dynamism that actualizes ideas. Another thing that's interesting too is the way we've spent so much, again, time looking at time and almost nothing looking at space. So there's this massive one-sidedness to difference and repetition, right? Which obviously is not unique to Deleuze, but just interesting to note. Space has really been left out in the cold here. So, that's fine, whatever. That's what it is. So space and time, this is the important thing. Let's get back into the thread, though, into the story. Space and time don't exist in the process of actualization itself, but only in its outcome, in the actual terms, species and parts. So this is something I remember saying when we were talking about the three syntheses, that time is not in the fundamental nature of reality, if you like. It's not in the metaphysical bedrock itself. It emerges from that. which means that our metaphysics has to be wide enough, broad enough to encompass this emergence of time as well. So we have to go, and that's kind of, I think, where Deleuze is going with this. We want to be able to explain the emergence of time. We don't want to just presuppose it as an a priori fundamental feature that's built in, baked into the universe itself. We want it to emerge from something and to try and explain how that emergence takes place. And I think that's what Deleuze is getting at here. It doesn't exist in the process itself, but only in the outcome. There's no time outside of the actualization of ideas, but it emerges in the actualization of ideas as this dynamism that propels it forward along with space. And then we get this very unusual twist at the end of this chapter where Deleuze starts talking about consciousness all of a sudden. So I'll give you the quote and then we can have a look at it. Actualization takes place in three series: space, time, and also consciousness. Every spatio-temporal dynamism is accompanied by the emergence of an elementary consciousness which itself traces directions, doubles movements and migrations, and is born on the threshold of the condensed singularities of the body or object whose consciousness it is. So this is, when I read this, it was kind of a shock, actually. And it seems quite random, just appears out of nowhere, suddenly consciousness. I mean, I don't think Deleuze has defined consciousness at all. Certainly not elementary consciousness, whatever that's supposed to mean. The only time we've talked about consciousness in the past is as the cogito, right? The Cartesian sense of consciousness. And then suddenly here it is, all actualization takes place in three series: space, time, and consciousness. So everything that's actualized, every idea that's actualized is conscious in some way. I mean, that sounds like idealism to me. Or panpsychism, something along those lines. So I've spent this whole video series arguing that Deleuze is not an idealist. I don't think he is. But then we get this very strange passage, strange to me anyway, where he says now every actualization includes an elementary consciousness. But again, it's hard to read too much into this because, like I say, he hasn't defined consciousness. We don't know what he means when he says an elementary consciousness. If all he means by the word consciousness is something that a movement or that dynamism which traces directions, which doubles movements and migrations, which is that dynamic force actualizing and incarnating the idea. If that's what he means by consciousness, then sure, everything's conscious, or consciousness always appears with every actualization. But when we hear the word consciousness, we immediately think human-like consciousness, right? Intentionality, subjectivity, what it's like to be something, that terrible, I think, explanation or definition of consciousness. So yeah, to me it's very random and just doesn't seem to fit with my understanding of Deleuze indifference and repetition at all. Even though we've come close to the edge with talk of larval subjects and these kinds of things. We've talked about soul and things as well, mind. But now to just like throw in this out of left field consciousness. The only there are only two things I can really say about this. First, this consciousness surely is not the cogito. It's not human consciousness. And second, whatever he means by this word consciousness here, especially elementary consciousness, it must be something that has almost no resemblance, bears almost no resemblance to what we usually mean when we use the word consciousness. But I couldn't leave that section and not say anything on it, even though, like I say, I can't see how it fits in to the rest of the text at all. It's this glaring anomaly in there. Anyway, so that's what all I have to say about that little section on consciousness. And then finally we talk about potentiality very briefly. So remember those three elements, or those three aspects of the sufficient reason: qualitability, quantitability, and potentiality. We talked about those. Well, we've dealt with the first two of these here: qualitability, quantitability, when we talked about differentiation with a C. But that leaves us with potentiality. What is this? And Deleuze says it must be a pre-quantitative and pre-qualitative dramatization. So it's a dramatization beneath the dramatization that we've discovered or we've talked about already with the spatio-temporal drama, the spatio-temporal dynamism. He says, he even goes so far as to say, it's that potentiality is that which differentiates with a C, the differentiation with a C again. So that which differentiates the differentiation. So differentiation, going beneath, going one step down to get behind the spatio-temporal dynamism itself, that which grounds this dramatization. And that's what we're going to talk about more in chapter 5. Which means we must be at our summary. So first up, differentiation and differentiation. Differentiation with a T. We talked about this being virtual, ideal, complete, the idea as a problem, and we also described it as dialectical. So there were two halves to this half of the object. The first was varieties of relations, and this was the reciprocal determinations. And then the second half, the singular points, those singularities, which map onto the complete determination in the idea. We also talked about the way this shouldn't be conflated with the possible. The possible was opposed to the real, whereas the virtual was opposed to the actual. The possible refers to identity in the concept, whereas the virtual designated a multiplicity in the idea. And possibility is the image of the real. So the real resembles the possible, whereas the virtual never resembles the singularities that it incarnates. Then we looked at differentiation with a C. And this was actual, concrete, whole. It represented the idea as solution. And we also talked about this as aesthetic. Oh, maybe we didn't. This is aesthetic as well, though. This is the aesthetic half of the object. In contrast to, so what this was actualizing from the idea, the varieties of relations in the idea actualized as species, and the singular points in the idea incarnated as distinct parts. We also talked about distinctness and clarity here, and the way that Deleuze talked about distinct. The more distinct something is, the less clear it is, and vice versa. And this made sense when we related these notions to differentiation with a T and differentiation with a C. Finally, we talked about spatio-temporal dynamism, and the idea here is that actualization presupposes these spatio-temporal dynamisms. They are like the engine driving actualization, and they only emerge, they themselves arise through the process of actualization. They're not in the process itself. They emerge as outcomes. But they're related to actualization as dramas, was the word that Deleuze used. So they dramatize the idea, a nice word in the sense that it lets us see the difference between space and time as concepts and space and time as this dynamic force. So space, we looked at the distinction of space into multiple levels, in particular the internal and the external, and the way that those were themselves could be divided up into further spaces, local and global integrations and connections. And then time, we talked briefly about this, which manifested in actualization as differential rhythms. The important point here, emphasizing this, they're not concepts. They're related to the actualization of concrete realities. Finally, we looked at potentiality, and this was the pre-quantitative and pre-qualitative dramatization. So it was the differentiation with a C of the differentiation again with a C. In other words, it's that which grounds dramatization. It's the foundation for the spatio-temporal dynamisms. And that's us for this video. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that helped. I'll see you in the next video where we'll look at chapter 5. But I'm going to have to take a break next week. I have a tennis tournament actually on Friday and Saturday, so I'm going to be miles away from home. I won't be able to do a video, but 2 weeks later we'll get into chapter 5. Thanks for watching. Catch you then.